To you all, the Arabists in the room, raise your hands. The Arabists, if you're doing one-on-one, raise your hand. Very good. If you are a supporter of the Arabic language, raise your hand. I hope everybody else is. Great, so you're in the right place. Thank you for coming. I know most of you are busy and some of you are thinking, I live far away, it's going to be late, but I'm going to do this anyway. I guarantee you it's going to be worth it tonight. Tonight we have a very special guest and a colleague and a friend, Dr. Alexander Key. He is going to give us a talk on old Arabic theory, for those of you who like old stuff. And also you need to know that Arabic is one of the most ancient languages. It's a beautiful language, and it has classical, it's medieval and modern, and what we speak right now is a very standard modern of it. And the colloquial also is everywhere. So by going back to the tradition of old Arabic theory, we're talking about language as it is in Arabic, in classical Arabic poetry, the language of the Quran, as well as the Arabic bell letters of the classical era. Dr. Alexander Key's interests range across the literary and intellectual history of the Arabic and Persian-speaking world, from the 7th century in particular, together with Western political thought and philosophy. He received his PhD in Arabic and Islamic Studies from Harvard University's Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations in May 2012. And luckily for us, in the Bay Area, he started also working at Stanford that same year. He is currently writing a book entitled The Arabic Obsession with Language, which I really love because this is exactly what we are. We're so obsessed with language. And theory in the 11th century. The book looks at ma'na, and those of you who know Arabic will know the word ma'na. One of its meaning is meaning. So it looks at ma'na in the thought of Ibn Furaq, Al-Raghib al-Asfahani, Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and Abd al-Qahir al-Jurjani. Dr. Key is also preparing a second book for publication, an intellectual biography of Al-Raghib al-Asfahani that includes an edition of the Lamberg 175, the Unicum manuscript of Al-Raghib's Poetics. Dr. Key has authored a number of articles on aspects of classical Arabic literature and culture. These include a chapter co-authored with Peter Adamson on the debate between grammar and logic, a study of Quranic inimitability in Al-Raghib, and an argument against calling classical Arabic civilization quote-unquote humanist. Beyond his research, he teaches an undergrad course on the ethics of jihad and is also a founding editor of the double-blind peer-reviewed journal for early career scholars, No Middle Eastern Studies. I also would like to say that he continues to blog on Arcade. He has a fantastic page on Stanford's Arcade. You should read his work. He's so generous with his scholarship. He writes about things that matter to him, but also to us. One of the things that I read and really was inspired by is that he started a project of accumulating old writings in English on the metaphor, which I find resourceful, and he consulted all of you. So he's very, very collaborative and incredibly generous, and I think you will see this both from his talk and from his follow-up Q&A session. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Key to our campus tonight.
Hello. So thank you, Mohammed, for that very kind introduction. I think that most of the things Mohammed said about me and Arcade and my scholarship are also true of him. And in fact, one of the major reasons that I'm here is that we had a very productive conversation sort of through Arcade and through the blogs about what on earth it meant to study Arabic as part of foreign languages and literatures, or as part of comparative literature, and what it felt like to be studying Arabic, and whether people listened to us as much as they should, or more or less than they should. So there's a couple of fun things on the internet. What I'd like to do today is, and I'm greatly cheered by the amount of Arabic students in the audience, is sort of run through the book that I spent the summer writing that Mohammed mentioned. So here it is. I don't want to read the whole thing. It could take a while. The thing that I would say first, actually, is that I've changed the title. And I changed the title because a friend of mine, who's actually a professor emerita at San Francisco State, Margot Osakawa Ray, who was here working on gender and retired a few years ago, she said that you can't call it the Arabic obsession with language because that's just got too much Orientalist baggage. Like the whole Orient being obsessed with things, she thought it had too many red flags, and I think she might be right. So I changed the title. Now the title is Arabic Theory. Arabic Theory, the 11th century of Ibn Furak, Raghib, Avicenna, and Giorgiani. But I'm open to suggestions for better titles, or indeed strong advocacy for going back to the original one and disagreeing with.
We'll talk.
I prepared a handout. All the handout is the chapter, the chapter contents of the book, just to give you a sense of what the whole thing looks like. And what I'm going to do in the next sort of 40 minutes or so is read some sections that will hopefully give you a sense of what the whole thing looks like, and give you a sort of an introduction to the world that I'm talking about, which is a pretty unfamiliar world, and that unfamiliarity is largely chronological. It's not so much unfamiliar because it's Arabic, because you're already studying Arabic, but it's unfamiliar because it's 1,000 years old. So I'm going to start off by reading a section from which is about the four people that the book are about, the four people that the title tells you that the book are about. And it's a section in which I try and remind the reader that what happens when we talk about Arabic scholars, famous names like Avicenna from this period, we're not relying on the sort of information that we're more familiar with when we talk about historical figures. We're not, there aren't very many autobiographies, there's not that much information. We're dealing with these snippets that we get in biographical dictionaries across the centuries after these people die, and all the people who write these snippets in these biographical dictionaries have got particular axes to grind in one or another direction. So the process by which people become famous and the reputations they get are kind of shaped by this biographical tradition, the tabaqat literature of the subsequent centuries. So these innumerable biographical dictionaries produced across all disciplines and confessional identities get scaled up by their authors for detail into things that are this big on the shelf, or down for concision. So it's something small that you can carry around with you that just has one line per person. And sometimes they have very lax and Catholic and open attitudes to whom they include, and sometimes they have very rigorously policed boundaries. So this is a Hanbali tabaqat, it's just people who are in the Hanbali school, a particular theological, legal school at a particular time, and you've got to keep everybody else out in order to say what you. So your biography is kind of doing the job for an intellectual society of kind of saying who's in and who's not, like letters of reference today, or departmental boundaries. Are you in foreign language and literatures, or are you in English? What does it mean to have that title? So what we get from these collections of biographies is this massive self-referential and self-disciplining archive. It's produced contention and invention, and that's all we have. And in this archive, stretching from the 11th century up to today, the four authors that I'm dealing with fare quite differently. So first of all, Ibn Furak, Abu Bakr Muhammad bin al-Hasan Furak, enjoys a decorated career teaching and debating theology across what is now Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan, until his death by poisoning in 1015, when he was around 75 years old. So Ibn Furak appears first of all in the biographical tradition in the exegesis of one of his students, a famous Sufi, Abu Qasim al-Qushayri. Al-Qushayri mentions Ibn Furak in a very nice way, with great veneration. This is somebody who's very pious, from whom I've learned a great deal. These stories about how Ibn Furak was once taken in chains to Shiraz because he was out of favour with the politicians, and then he saw a mosque inscription at daybreak that said, God takes care of his servants. And he knew in his heart that he would be released, and this is kind of an inspirational story that Qushayri tells to get his readers on board with the Sufi project. If we read another later scholar's account of Ibn Furak's life, we get a kind of different story of Ibn Furak as somebody who's always engaged in theological, political disagreements. He has this big set of disagreements with a rival school, and then when he's travelling back from the debates, travelling back to Nishapur, in what's now Iran, he's poisoned and he dies. Then as the centuries go on, these biographical notices, they get informed by each other, and they start filling in extra bits of the story. And we can't really tell from where we are now whether they're making it up or whether they're getting extra sources that we don't have access to at the moment. So a little bit later, you get Ibn Salah al-Shahrazuri, who writes a famous book on the science of hadith, who tells us that a little bit more detail about this theological controversy that got Ibn Furak poisoned. Apparently, he was executed by Mahmud of Ghazna, who's a big political leader, sort of towards the border with India and Afghanistan, a big Sunni political leader. And he's poisoned for saying that the Prophet Muhammad was, quote-unquote, just a messenger, Rasul, during his lifetime, and then after his lifetime he stops being a Rasul, a messenger, and then is just a prophet, Nabi. So that's enough to get you executed. So that doesn't necessarily tell us that Mahmud al-Ghazni is crazy and executing people for minor semantic differences. What it tells us is that Mahmud of Ghazna, a big successful political leader, and the society that he's engaged in leading, this is the kind of political statement that matters most. Like, these little semantic differences are how politics is being constituted. Like, this is what wars are being fought about, this is what careers are being made, this is how controversies are happening. The other thing that this incident tells us, and this comes through again in the way that the theological controversy gets reported, is it tells us that there's this strong thread. There's one strong tradition of arguing about these little word differences, where Ibn Furak thinks it's okay to make the distinction that, strictly speaking, the prophet is a prophet at one point and a messenger at another point. And this is like a valuable distinction to make. It's not just wasting time on words or parsing like finely grained minutiae that don't have any relationship to what really matters, i.e. whether the prophet was actually a prophet or not. So you have that strain of arguing about word meanings, and then you have another strong strain where people say, no, this is ridiculous, this stuff doesn't matter. Stop arguing about tiny stupid word meanings. What really matters is the big important stuff, is Muhammad a prophet, is Sunni Islam the right choice, etc. there's a story that comes out where Ibn Furak is telling the ruler. He's saying God should not be described as being high, because if you describe God as high, then that logically opens the door to saying God is low, because he might be high at some times and low at others, and that would be problematic, because you can't describe God as low, because that would be kind of pejorative, that would be kind of a bad thing to say, and that's theologically a wrong choice of action. And Ibn Furak is going through the kind of fine-grained logic of this argument, and Mahmud of Ghazni explains, silence! I wasn't even going to describe him until you started pressuring me. Ibn Furak, the scholar, is rendered speechless and dies shortly thereafter. So what that story tells us is there's this strong, there's a narrative of impatience with exactly the kind of fine-grained arguing about meaning that Ibn Furak spent most of his career doing. So, and then again, once you have these complex controversies in this biographical tradition that I'm talking about, you get later biographical dictionaries trying to kind of smooth everything out and get rid of the craziness and make it all a nice clean story. So in the 14th century, Taj ad-Din as-Subki has a very long entry on Ibn Furak. He reviews all the sources, he has a critical commentary, he has extra hagiographic anecdotes about Ibn Furak. If there was a Quran in any house he visited, he would stay up all night reading it. It's a story to show how pious Ibn Furak is. And then he says, look, it wasn't Mahmud of Ghazna's fault. That whole story about the argument about naming God is fake. The poisoning was really what this rival theological school did when they couldn't get Mahmud of Ghazna to execute Ibn Furak for disagreeing with them. So this is like somebody telling a historical story and kind of plotting the right way to do it, because he doesn't want to blame Mahmud of Ghazna, who's a big important historical figure for the revival and the creation of Sunni Islam. And he doesn't want to blame Ibn Furak either, because he wants to make Ibn Furak a pious 11th century scholar. So he kind of discredits some bits of the story and argues with other bits in order to produce a nice clean narrative. So what all this does, apart from providing a fascinating window for people like me into the biographical and taxonomical processes of Islamic scholarship, what this shows us is that Ibn Furak was well read and well known amongst the great scholars of his time, famous as far afield as Islamic Spain in the century of his death, and that how he talked about God was representative of how theology was working in the 11th century. So the reason I'm interested in this is if the way that Ibn Furak talks about God is really important for the 11th century, then Ibn Furak is kind of the perfect person for me to look for how he uses this particular Arabic word, ma'na. And so if I'm looking for people who are particularly obsessed with exactly what words mean, Ibn Furak's a perfect example. And again, kind of interestingly for looking at the history of Islamic scholarship from the 21st century, Ibn Furak's most famous book, and the book which people quote most often, is a book in which he says he's doing Mujarrad Maqalat al-Ashari. He's doing like a condensed version of the sayings of al-Ashari. Al-Ashari is an even more famous Islamic theologian, one of the central theological figures of Sunni Islam. So Ibn Furak writes a book that's really, from the title and the purpose, just about reporting someone else's views, al-Ash'ari's views, because al-Ash'ari is more famous and important. And yet as he does this, he kind of shapes them and edits them and cuts out the bits he doesn't agree with, and occasionally says, look, this doesn't make sense, and occasionally says, you know, there's a report that Ash'ari said this, but quite frankly none of the rational scholars in our time adhere to it anymore. So it's like he's performing transmission, like he's performing the transmission of this big authority, but what he's actually doing is creating a new synthesis that's his. Mm-hmm. And what I think scholarship has kind of failed to do is recognize this. Lots of people have read Ibn Furak's Mujarrad Maqalat al-Ash'ari and mined it for information about al-Ash'ari, but they haven't really looked at it to see what Ibn Furak thought and how Ibn Furak used language, which is what I'm doing in this, in the first big chapter. The other three people in the book, we have Raghib al-Isfahani, who's the person I wrote my dissertation on, and he's kind of the exact opposite to Ibn Furak. Ibn Furak is literally, when somebody does a list of a book of biographies of famous people from the city of Nishapur, Ibn Furak is the first name on the list. Raghib is not on anybody's lists. He doesn't appear in biographical dictionaries. There's like virtually no information about his life to be found anywhere. There's lots of conflicting stuff about when he died. It's even like a century of disagreement. Did he die now or did he die 100 years later? So he just hasn't got picked up by the biographical tradition. But it's not because he's unimportant. On the contrary, Raghib's glossary of the words in the Quran, Mu'jam Mufradat Alfaz al-Quran, which is his most famous book, is in every single Islamic library now, I would say, pretty much. It's an absolutely standard text. Like any collection of manuscripts, Arabic, Islamic, Quran-related manuscripts, pretty much anywhere in the world, from like Africa to Iran. So Russia is going to have a copy of Raghib's Mufradat al-Faz al-Quran. It was hugely popular. There are loads and loads of copies of it, and that tells us it was hugely popular. It's still being printed. It's being printed in Egypt all the time. It's being printed in Iran. You can get it. You can find it very easily on the internet. It's very accurate text. So this is somebody whose work is really important, but his biography kind of gets lost. And I think the reason for that is that he didn't fit into any of the clean categories that the biographical tradition was interested in. So he wasn't clearly a Hanbali in one school of law, or he wasn't clearly in another school of theology. He kind of seems to mix and match between them. So if you're writing a report and you're doing a biography of like famous people who are in the school, yeah, you kind of leave Raghib out because some of his positions are a bit funny. But that doesn't tell us that he was some kind of crazy iconoclast in the 11th century. For all we know, in the 11th century, he had a lot of people around him who agreed with him, and he was absolutely middle of the road, and there were lots of people who had this combination of views that sort of mixed Aristotle and rationalism and, you know, the sort of and the sort of attitudes that would now be called maybe like Wahhabi or Salafi. And Raghib just mixes them all up. Maybe there were lots of people like that, it's just they didn't make it through these centuries of negotiated biographical dictionaries that we were looking at with Ibn Furak. Number 3 is Avicenna. Avicenna, who I guess before I started the talk, how many people had heard of Avicenna? Yeah, I mean, he's not unfamous. He's on the, when I lived in the Middle East and I went to get my teeth done for a long period, it took like a year, constant dentist visits, the dentist had a picture of Ibn Sina on the wall in the waiting room because he's the big, famous figure of great Arabic medicine. Avicenna's work on medicine was the standard reference work in Europe from pretty much the 12th century right up to the 17th century. He's an absolutely central figure to the Latin tradition and an absolutely central figure to the Arabic tradition. We have kind of the opposite problem. There's a massive amount of information available about Avicenna. Massive amount of information. What I do with Avicenna is I focus on something that people haven't cared about as much, which is how his attitudes to language. And this is somebody who is basically famous as a logician and a doctor. This is somebody who studies the works of Aristotle, studies the works of Galen, writes a big book on medicine, and a big book on logic. And yet he's at the court of one of these patrons or rulers, the Ala ad-Dawla, Muhammad, in about like the year 1030, and a famous lexicographer, so a famous author of a dictionary, says to him, "Anta mantaqiyyun ma nu'riduka wa kalamuka fi lughat al-Arab ma nardah." You're a logician, we don't compare, and as for your ideas about Arabic, we don't care. And this was when Avicenna was a big, powerful figure. So what this tells us is that you can be a big, powerful figure in logic and medicine and politics. And Avicenna was like, he was as powerful in Iran as, say, Ashton Carter is in America. Like we talk, he was a big political leader and a big intellectual figure and a doctor and a logician. And still, he's getting accused in public of not knowing enough about word meanings and dictionaries by people like Abu Mansur al-Jaban, who are authors of dictionaries. So if you remember the Ibn Furak arguments about word meanings, where Ibn Furak was parsing all these little things about exactly what you should call God, this is more evidence that what we have in this 11th century context is a situation where words really matter. I mean, if you think of the way in English today we say that's just semantics. Like if we say that's just semantics, we're saying it's kind of stupid. Like, don't waste your time with it. It's just words. This period I'm dealing with, that would not have been an insult. Like it would have been the opposite. It would have been like intellectual praise, and that's what we can tell from these anecdotes with Razi, Abu Mansur al-Razi, and Ibn Sina. Then the fourth person is moving into poetry. And the whole question of what is it that makes poetry good. And again, this would seem to be kind of a big jump. Like if you think that everything I've been talking about thus far is theology, it's theories about theology, it's theories about law, it's theories about logic. For Raghib's case, it's sort of dictionaries and Quranic word meanings. And then we jump to poetry. That would seem to be like a big gap. But it wasn't a big gap. When we go back to the 11th century, we find that people were all working on the whole mix. There was an assumption that you should, if you were a serious intellectual, even if you were working on logic, or if you were working on science or optics or algebra, the assumption was that you should know about the Arabic dictionary and you should be able to write a dictionary and you should know poetry. There's another story that Avicenna gets accused of not knowing poetry, and he's so embarrassed that the great doctor and logician goes away and composes some poetry and comes back again. Again, it just tells us how important poetry was. And the thing I always, the example I tend to give here is like, who can tell me about President Obama's second inaugural poem? Did he have one? Is this a trick? Yeah, nobody knows. Nobody knows. Nobody cares. I asked this question, of pretty much any audience, even alleged, senior scholars of poetry. No one has any idea. President Obama had an inaugural poem. Second poet, Cuban-American poet, on the steps of the Capitol at the inauguration, stands up, delivers a poem that he's composed for the occasion. It's on TV. It has zero cultural impact on the American moment. Zero. And that is inconceivable back in the 11th century. Like, back in the 11th century, if you ask any random group of people, oh, what about, the poem that so-and-so recited on such and such a date, everybody would know. And everybody would be able to repeat it back to you. And again, all that tells us is that, just like, oh, that's just semantic, like word meanings and the status of poetry just have a very different kind of role in society, like a very different socio-political role to the role they have today. So I think what I'd like to do now is talk. Well, first I'll talk a little bit about something from the introduction.